Three, two, one, action.
Well, let me tell you something, brother.
I'm good. I don't know. Dude, I've been doing so many of these, it's switching from like StreamYard to whatever. This one, there we go. It wasn't catching for some reason.
I mean, it's probably worn down with the amount of interviews you've done. So I mean, I don't
Yeah,
blame
yeah,
you.
exactly, exactly. I think it's the record is all scratched up. Let me see if my headphones work real quick for you, so we'll
All
be better
good.
off. Is that still good?
Yeah, all good. How you doing,
Okay,
man?
yeah.
How's the chaos of release week been?
It's awesome, man. It's been great. It's you spend years and years writing these things on your own, interview, all the interviews, all the research, and then you just kind of huddle up and get it done. So, being able to talk about it now is just awesome.
Yeah, can I just say this is I'm just gonna throw out a popular wrestling term. I'm gonna acknowledge you for a second because I've just
Okay.
been obviously I've been like researching you a little bit and watching. I've been watching some few interviews as well, and just your enthusiasm, man. For I know obviously you have to sell your product and things like that, but you have genuine enthusiasm and passion for like this project and obviously other projects you've done, and I just love to see that. And I just genuinely like I was not that I wasn't excited to talk to you anyway, but it was even more so after seeing that kind of stuff. I'm like, that's just it's infectious. So kudos to you for that, I
Oh,
guess.
thanks, man. I don't think you can overstate like when you do one of these books, you have to be fascinated and enthralled with the subject. And so I have been, and so to get to talk about it's awesome. So I'm glad it comes through.
Yeah, and then this is like I know this is like a lifelong I guess maybe lifelong passion for you. I think you said it's I don't know how many years in the making, at least 10 years I think you said in the making to try to do this book. But can you like give us your almost history with wrestling? Because I know you grew up watching Macho Man, and I think you got to the point where you were doing shoots and for Muscle and Fitness with like Batista and things of that nature.
Yeah.
So could you almost, I don't know, give you a little history with professional wrestling?
Yeah, so I was a fan of wrestling as long as I think I've been a fan of anything. I was probably 5 or 6 or 7. My first wrestler who I followed was Big John Studd, which is definitely in the very early '80s of wrestling. I used to call myself Little John Studd when I'd run around the house and do his moves. But most of those guys were kind of big, lumbering guys. You had Hogan, you had Big John Studd, obviously Andre the Giant. Macho, when he came up and kind of came on the scene, was one of the first guys for those of us who were like, I'm probably not going to be 7 feet tall and a giant. Like he was athletic, he was jacked, he was his obviously his outfits were eye catching, but like his voice, his catchphrases, he just made you like stare at him and want to hear what was going to come out of his mouth next. And then there was a little bit of a relatability factor. Like there was no one better to do their moves of. Like I would take my little brother and put him on a beanbag and just elbow drop off my bed, like repeatedly over and over again. That was way cooler than a leg drop or like a clothesline or the other signature moves of the day. So as long as I can remember being a fan of anything, especially wrestling, I've been a fan of Macho Man.
Yeah, and it's got to the point where obviously you've done this book, but you also I think if I'm right, I think you were working for Muscle Fitness and you had interactions with wrestlers during that time as well.
Yeah, I wanted to be a writer for, when we pick what we want to do with our lives. And I started out in the early 2000s. I wrote for a lot of men's magazines. So I wrote
Mm.
for GQ, Men's Health, Men's Fitness, Muscle and Fitness. If it had men's or health or fitness in the title, I was likely writing for them at some point in time. But I was on staff for Muscle and Fitness. And I did a lot of our big cover stories with athletes. And because of the musculature, a lot of the guys, we did a lot of stories with WWE guys. So yeah, I did a Batista, a cover story with Batista, which was awesome. We actually shot the whole entire photo shoot in John Cena's gym,
Oh
which
wow.
was cool in Tampa. Yeah, it just happened to work out from a location standpoint. Batista was going to be working out there anyway. It's like an off the beaten path, just hangar of weights and cool stuff. And then I did a cover story with Brock Lesnar and Triple H and a lot of those guys. So that was my first experience in terms of writing and interviewing wrestlers. And we did a lot of stuff over the years, smaller stories that weren't cover stories too. And that I guess kind of gave me a little bit of the confidence that, this is my 10th book, but that I'd be able to cover Macho Man properly.
Did you know back then that so early 2000s that one day I'm gonna write a Macho Man book?
Hmm. Macho Man has always been on my radar. I think every author who does nonfiction type books and biographies probably has a bucket list in the back of their mind of, I wish I could do this book. Like this would be perfect. I like to do books that are very nostalgia heavy, that bring up, a visceral reaction in people when they see the name or
Mm.
hear the name or talk about what they accomplished. So yeah, Macho Man was always there. I knew the amount of work it would take to scale a person like Macho from baseball to his family's history to wrestling to the mainstream crossover. Biographies are no, they're no joke. They're just years and like when you first start, you've got months and months and months of research and interviews before you even start writing. You've got hundreds of thousands of words ahead of you to get to the final 300 plus pages or whatever you're aiming for. And so I'd always wanted to get there. And then after I finished my previous book, 1996, a biography of a year, which hadn't really been done, I was just felt like I was ready and it was time to get Macho done.
In that 1996 biography, am I correct in saying there's moments you touch on wrestling as well?
Yeah, so 1996 a biography is about like that. It's a line of demarcation in sports and entertainment. Like there's before 1996 and then there's after. So for instance, before 1996, collectively as a sports and entertainment, loving populace, we weren't talking about Tiger Woods or Kobe Bryant or Allen Iverson. There was no MLS, there was no WNBA. Mike Tyson hadn't made his comeback yet. There was all these rookie years happened at the same time. And one of the big ones was that The Rock and Stone Cold made their debuts
Yeah.
both in the WWE. Obviously, The Rock as Rocky Maivia and Stone Cold as the ringmaster. But that was the first year they came in the public consciousness. I know, we had stunning Steve Austin and stuff before that, but from a WWE perspective, that was our first taste of those guys. And so that chapter in that book, I really was like, I really like doing this. I interviewed The Miz for that book, and we talked about Randy a lot. That was one of his big influences. And so it just felt like I was ready to go. And then I wanted to get in touch with Lanny Poffo, who was his brother. That took about a year. But once that happened and he was open to being interviewed for the book, things finally took off.
Yeah. I mean that's a perfect. I don't think you planned it, but it seemed like a perfect segue into Macho Man. Um y- One of the things that shocked me as well when I found out about this book, about your book for Macho Man, is the fact that we've never had a Macho Man book.
Yeah,
Like really,
thankfully.
like for yeah, I mean, and I was gonna say like for you, great. I mean, because I was just shocked because we've had quite a few documentaries. WWE produced like a really solid one back in like 2014. There was an A&E one. Dark Side of the Ring did one about Macho Man and Liz, but no books. And then I like shocked me because like Hulk Hogan's had books, like even not necessarily autobiographies, but biographies. People have done countless on Andre and
Mhm.
etc., but never on Macho Man Randy Savage. Were you ever worried that someone was gonna beat you to the punch? And also, are you equally shocked that there was never one before you?
Yeah, to answer the first part of your question, yeah, I was really worried, especially when it got close, when I was sitting around with the proposal. I wrote the proposal for the book and I had some publishers interested, and I wasn't going to do it if I couldn't talk to Lanny. I know
Yeah.
people had reached out to him in the past and he wasn't really amenable or just was like, go ahead, I'm not going to be involved. So that was my worry, was that and I didn't know it was going to be a year. I remember reaching out to him like, on a Monday, and it's like, oh, I'll probably hear Tuesday. We had some text back and forth. It wasn't like he dissed me or ghosted me or anything. It just took a while. And during that time, I was like, God, please don't like go on Publishers Weekly and see that it doesn't even matter if it's a big name, young name, just that it wasn't announced that another company was doing a Macho Man book. And so, yeah, when I finally announced it, which is always kind of the moment of truth that another publisher is not going to be like, we're actually 6 months into this or whatever, I was confident that it was going to be. I mean, I think I have a big enough presence as a writer that people would be able to know if it was happening or not. The other part of your question about whether I was, was I surprised? Yeah, I think I'd like to think that it's real. He's an intimidating topic. There's so much to cover. And again, people have done biographies of, there's 50 biographies of Winston Churchill. There's 100 of Teddy Roosevelt. Like people tackle these titans all the time. And so I'm putting Macho in the same breath as those guys. For us, he probably is.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
like, but you get like the idea of it's just an undertaking, and maybe people didn't think so. And I think also there was an underrated like acceptance of how big his legacy is. There were certainly publishers who were like, "Why?" And I was like, "Do you not understand?" And that's selling books anyway. You're used
They
to
actually,
hearing.
they actually, sorry, they actually, sorry to cut you off. They actually questioned why.
Oh
about
yeah,
Macho
there's
Man? Oh,
I
what?
probably have I have well probably 7 or 8 publishers who I don't call out who were like, I don't see it. And I was like, you don't see it?
Wow.
I've written, it's not like my first book either. I was like
Yeah.
baffled sometimes. And I think part of it is just the way publishing can be, where the rooms are not dude heavy, and you're in a room and it's not to knock any part of it, but there's just not wrestling fans in there. They don't
Mm,
get it. So you're pitching this proposal, and you have a bunch of people in there who maybe are too young, or maybe just didn't follow it, or just weren't into it, who are just not going to understand what it means. So that was why ultimately, you had mentioned Andre the Giant, the big biography that his ECW Press did his book. They
yes.
had a Ric Flair biography that I already knew was coming out. And so I really kind of targeted them that they would get it and understand why it mattered. And some of the larger publishers, it was like shockingly an uphill of like explaining who he was, like, oh, the guy from the memes. And I'd be like, you couldn't have less understanding of what he means to. I'm not saying he's like he's not some niche, minor league, college guy who, from
Yeah.
small town. Like, this guy was an apex A-list celebrity for like a decade,
Mm.
crossed over all over the place. So I didn't want to be making a deal with someone who was like, I'm educating them. I wanted someone who was like, oh my God, there hasn't been a book. We have to do this. And that's what I ended up with.
Yeah, perfect. And I think and yeah, ECW Press was definitely the perfect place for that. Um one of the things that it also does is I was listening to a podcast today actually. There's a new book called The Six Pack, which Chris Jericho interviewed the author. It's about like wrestlers
Yeah,
and
Brad. Yeah, my
uh,
friend Brad and we're buddies, and in
oh,
fact,
amazing.
I recorded Jericho like right after. I think mine's next week. So
Oh, no, no.
we've been crisscrossing each other. I've known Brad since he did the Wax Pack, which is an awesome book, and I
Oh,
promoted
amazing.
my Books and Biceps newsletter last time. So we've been having a lot of fun with just like, oh, you're first. Oh, I'm first this time. Okay. Oh yeah, warm them up for me. That kind of stuff. So
Nice, nice. But like he said on that, Jericho I think said to Brad on that podcast, because Brad he said that about the six pack that it's actually a unique book and that's something that's hard to do, something that's not been done before in the wrestling space with like literature. And but in a way, even though biographies are common, but this biography has never been done before. So you're also doing that, like a
yeah.
book that's never been done before. So it's again hard to do in this today's day and age.
Yeah, and there's this idea that, and I would put some of the other major sports in this category as well, that somehow these things have become like niche, like a baseball book is now a niche thing, or even an athlete book. And I'll say sports books in general have now been sort of marginalized. If you go to a Barnes and Noble or wherever your local bookstore is, you're not going to find. It used to be a whole aisle of sports books, and it just kind of keeps condensing and condensing, which is not makes no sense to me, because the amount of sports fans has only grown from what it was even when I was coming up. And
Yeah.
it's like, oh well, Sports Illustrated's dead, no one's reading sports. It's like, well, Sports Illustrated died for a whole host of other reasons, but not because there's a lack of sports interest. Look at ratings, look what people are paying attention to. And so the idea that a Macho Man book, from some of the feedback would be like, well, are there enough wrestling fans to support this book? And I'd be like, do you even live? Like, have you turned on a Raw or a SmackDown, or gone to, like, the numbers are through the roof for all these shows. They dwarf a basketball game a lot of times. They trend every single Monday and Friday. Not the NBA doesn't do that. The NFL obviously does.
Yeah.
Soccer in some places, or football does in some places. But it's bigger than tennis. It's bigger than golf. It's bigger than all these things. Bigger than hockey, even in the U.S. and Canada, parts of Canada. So yeah, it's a challenge. I think it's a challenge to do that. But now that it's out, and I'm doing hundreds of interviews, and the response has been awesome, and it's crossing over. It was mentioned on Sports Center. It's mentioned by John Cena,
Yeah.
did a nice endorsement of it, and it's getting into the New York Post and Boston Globe and major things. And same with Brad's book. It's kind of like with the two of us out here on the forefront saying, like, there is a massive audience of dudes who really like these books, and we should probably do more of them.
Yeah, no, perfect. And I love that. And also a side note, I mean, you mentioned John Cena. Did you expect that endorsement? Did you know that John had the book or had read the book?
We'd send it to a lot of people, and John, I'd heard, had it and enjoyed it through the grapevine of certain things, and so that was just awesome. I mean, having someone of that stature put their stamp of approval on a book, an icon stamping the approval of a book on another icon is about as good as it gets.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you kept mentioning there about how you had to sell this book, like and like get people on board with it, and like not people
Yeah.
not being aware. The Amazon description of the book. really encapsulates and like how big Macho was. So I don't know if in that you're like still trying to sell it to those people to be like,
Dude, that is
yeah,
I wrote that as the open. So a proposal is like 25 pages. It's like
yeah.
every little thing about the book, about who you are. It's got chapter samples, which you end up throwing away because you haven't interviewed anybody yet, but it's got a kind of a loose breakdown of chapters. I don't have to do sample chapters anymore, but if you're just starting out, you do have to have a sample chapter. Luckily, once you get going, you can send a whole book and say, here's how my books read, but like when you're doing these books, you have to, how would you market it? How would you promote it? What would a lot of times, like the easiest thing is like, what does the back cover say? And in fact, that is one of the only valuable things that I've found in all the books I've done is I do envision the back cover. What would the back cover read? And I wrote that very early on of like, all right, if I had that, that one page, that half page to catch somebody who maybe had never heard of this guy, what would it read like? And so that was one of the first things I sent out. And if you read that and aren't, obviously there's people who have nothing to do with wrestling and are never going to get into it. They're into romances or teen werewolf things or whatever the hell it is. Fine, that's to each their own. But if you're somewhat involved in this world and you read that and it doesn't kind of at least pique your interest or get you fired up, then that's the book's not for you. But it's the same thing from a publisher perspective. It's like this is what this is, and if you read this and go, damn, like this is great, then let's work together, and then people will want to read it. So thank you for noticing. That's my elevator pitch for the book and my little 30-second spot.
It worked, and I mean, it was easy to. I guess it's easier to work on someone like me. I was already interested,
Right.
but like reading it, I would just almost was reminded. I was like, damn! I was like, Macho was massive. Like
Yeah.
this guy was like not just in wrestling, pop culture. Like
Yes.
Macho was crossed over, transcended. He was just huge. So
Yeah.
was that like an aim of the book as well, in a way, to like actually get across that this guy was an absolute phenomenon?
Yeah, I tell his whole story from a, journalist biography perspective, from his father and his father's lineage all the way through. I think it's 300 pages, but I keep hearing my best comment is like he reads like a novel. It's fast, it's exciting. Every chapter starts with action, which is what I've done with all my books. I don't really waste time. I dive right into the best moment of whatever scene we're describing. And yeah, that was 100% one of the reasons why it was compelling to me to write it, but why I thought it has a chance to do what it's doing, which is cross over outside of just wrestling. As like anybody who grew up during this time period, you could not miss Macho Man. Even if you were a football fan or baseball or NASCAR, they had a Slim Jim car. He was everywhere, more so than any other wrestler. In addition to his wrestling, he was in. He would be on Arsenio, then Regis and Kelly or Regis and Kathy Lee at the time, and then he'd be on Baywatch, and then he was on Texas Ranger with Texas Walker, Texas Ranger with Chuck Norris. Like he was in video game voices and movie, like he really crossed over. And then Spider-Man, which is a fun part to write about. So
Yeah.
it's like he wasn't just, there's these guys who are maybe like kind of iconic to us, and this isn't a down, putting someone down type of thing at all. But you have guys like Ricky Steamboat, or the guy who we looked up to tremendously, who really
Mm.
are inside the wrestling world. I mean, maybe someone remembers the name, but inside of wrestling, one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. Loved him, you loved him, most of us who grew up with him. But there's no, like, it's sort of like you could have this conversation and most people may be familiar with me, maybe not, but there's no real public consciousness outside of the wrestling world.
Yeah.
But with Macho, it's everywhere. It's like, oh, Slim Jim. Oh, he was in Spider-Man. Oh,
Yeah.
he played baseball, right? He was a baseball player for a long time. Like it just hits a lot of different notes.
Yeah, no, 100%. And like I think I said, even as wrestling fans, I think we forget sometimes how some of these people have crossed over, like, and they're
Yeah.
going beyond professional wrestling.
Yeah.
Which I love the fact that I guess you remind us of, even just through the blurb. I haven't even actually dived into the book yet, and
Yeah.
be able to get my hands on it, but that's exciting. One of the things that's always interesting to hear about wrestling books, or when people are writing wrestling books, because I interviewed Pat, who did the Andre the Giant biography. Obviously, today I was listening to Brad's podcast with Jericho, and the common theme is tackling folklore in
Yeah.
wrestling and what's real, what was it, what's, because obviously during that specific time period, when especially when Macho and stuff were in their boom period, kayfabe was still very strong. They were protecting the business, so obviously certain stories were enhanced.
Yeah.
Uh, what was that challenge like? I don't know if it's as challenging, say, for example, you tell me if I'm wrong, obviously, Andre the Giant became very, very mythical and people blew a lot of things out of
Yeah, yeah.
proportion. So I don't know if it was as challenging as that, but I imagine still there's certain things where you couldn't tell what was what.
Yeah, and the added level of people just not really remembering things or not intentionally saying things wrong that they would say. So, for instance, like I did a lot of biographies on other athletes, and people just some of them remember things perfectly, and some have they think they remember things that didn't happen just because they've been telling the stories for so many years. It'll be like, oh, it was I hit 2 home runs on it was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. It's like, actually, no, you were 0 for 2 and it was raining, right? Like, because I can look at the box score in the newspaper and see like what happened, right? So that happens a lot with other athletes. With wrestlers, it's like their job is to entertain. So even with Macho Man, when it comes to even his name, he told two wildly different stories throughout his life that both had maybe a nugget of truth. And especially with wrestlers, but I do it with my kids. Like, you tell a story long enough, you lean into the parts that get a reaction and you start dumping the boring parts. And 10, 15, 20 years later, you've got this story that sounds great and is now a great soundbite. And people ask, and you roll right into it, and where the reaction or the pop's going to come, but it's not true anymore.
Yeah.
And with someone like Macho, you've got baseball, you've got the wrestling, you've got the stuff in the ring happening, you've got the stuff behind the scenes happening, that you really end up with like, I didn't with this book want to just be like the judge and jury, like, okay, this is what I believe happened. So book is really a ride where I tell the story and present the facts as I know them. So even in the Macho Man name, or a couple other things about where Randy Savage came from, the name Savage and things like that, I kind of present like, here's what he said latest in his career. Here's a story that he told forever. Here's a story in Judy Poffo, his mom's obituary, that's not true because the timeline can't work. Here's why these things aren't this way or that way. But ultimately, knowing all those things, here's what's likely true. But you've now got all the facts. You may disagree at the end of this, and not disagree like one way or the other, but like, there are timelines, there are newspaper articles, there are external things that happen in these guys' lives. There are hard dates and promo sheets for when certain things could have happened. So, Macho has a story where he talks about in the minor leagues, he got in a brawl. And after the brawl, the reporter called him Macho Man in the newspaper, and they put up a sign that said Macho Man hit it here. And none of this is true. He was Randy Poffo, not thinking about wrestling, die-hard baseball player trying to make the major leagues. If the Macho Man name had existed and he transitioned to wrestling, he would have used it right away, but he didn't for
Yeah.
years. And if it existed, the next day's paper that talked about the brawl would have mentioned it, and they didn't. And in fact, the brawl itself had several different versions from the reporters on the ground that day and the Tampa Tribune talking about it, that he didn't even charge the mound when he says he charged the mound. So, like, I get it, right? Like, if I'm him, the best story is, yeah, I got hit and I charged the mound and they called me a tough guy and Macho Man, and that's where it came from. And it sounds great,
Yeah.
except for he was still in baseball for another year and a half after that. Then he went to wrestling as Randy Poffo. Then he tried Savage. Then he went to Macho. So there's no way he was just sitting on this great Macho Man nickname for 4 years and decided to break it out, after 3 years of wrestling and 2 years of baseball.
How exhausting is that to decipher all that before you then have to actually finally write it in the final form?
It's the detective work of it is actually kind of exciting. It's nice when you're digging and pulling. It's nice in hindsight now because I've done all the research and I know all the angles. When you start, it's not frustrating, but it's a little nerve-wracking because you don't want to miss one. And all this stuff happened so long ago. And Randy passed away, and Lanny, and I interviewed him a lot, but then he passed away in the middle of writing
Mm.
the book. And Judy Poffo passed away, and his dad, and Miss Elizabeth. So certain these things you really have to rely on the first person account of the newspaper reporter who was there in 1973, plus the other corroborating accounts. Even the weather. He'll say, you say something, and weather is a very big indicator for a lot of things when they talk about a day or event happening outside or something, and you're like, oh, actually, wasn't really nice out that day, or like it was pouring rain. There's no way that was going on. So it's exciting when you finally are done, but it's a little bit kind of like banging your head against the wall because you're looking in these newspaper archives, you're looking at brochures, you're finding old radio interviews, and sometimes you'll be done with a story like this. And then you find something at the tail end of a newspaper article and you're like, oh, crap. So there's probably one other version of this. and you find it. But that comes from having done a lot of these books. You're okay. In the beginning, you're so eager to just be done. You're like, oh, this is great. And then you realize that like the only one who's going to pay for not doing that extra digging is you when the book comes out.
That's fair. I mean, I teach as well, and I always press the research side when students do essays and stuff, and they hate it, of course. But I'm like, guys, in the end, you'll thank me when I push you. And same goes here.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's permanent. When it's done, it's done. And the thing you also have to come to peace with is whenever you do these books, no matter how much time you spend, when the book is done, someone will read it, and I'll get a text or a random email or something on Twitter, and they'll be like, "Oh my God, how did you not talk to me? I was Macho Man. I lifted at the gym with him for 3 months back in whatever, or Charlie Ward. I used to play one-on-one with him, and you can't get in touch with everybody in
Yeah.
everybody's lives. And my response now that I'm fairly visible and I talk openly about the things I'm writing, and I like to bring readers on the process, is like, dude, I've been pretty open about this for a year. Like I interviewed hundreds and hundreds of people. If you didn't, if speak now or forever hold your peace. Like I tried, and at the end of every interview, when you're talking to your students about research, every journalist, you always ask the golden question, which is, thank you for your time. Is there anyone else that you think I have to talk to? Is there a story I have to look into? And oftentimes, especially in the beginning, eventually people repeat the same few things, but eventually
Yeah.
in the beginning, you hear things that you didn't know. Or, oh, you got to talk about the time Randy in the back of class with this thing, and it's like, oh, okay, I'll ask the next group of people these things, or oh, you got to talk to this one person who has this great story. And there's no way not everybody's on social media, not everybody's posting things, not everybody's writing about things or even talking about them. So really, the grunt work of the interviews gets you a window into these awesome stories.
It's like a chain. It just keeps
Yeah.
building. Yeah.
Yeah, and at some point you do have to call it quits, right? At some
Yeah.
point it's like, okay. And you kind of know when you've reached this fifth person telling the same thing that the first two, three, four, and five did, you can move on. But sometimes you're like, I mean, I'm sure it's happened to every biographer. You think you're good, you're talking to the last person, you're kind of on autopilot of like, did this happen? Oh, without, and then you ask that question, and they're like, you know what's funny? Now that I'm talking to you, there was this day when this, and this, and part of you is like, oh my God, that's awesome. And the other part is like, I just want to put this chapter to bed.
You obviously talked about doing countless interviews, and I know you said in one of your interviews you said if there was no Lanny Poffo, no book, which I totally get, and I would have agreed with because he was the main source. But
Yeah.
having it's like, I guess you'd have no Liz, have no, obviously his dad was passed, his mom was passed, and obviously it had to be Lanny. But was there anyone outside of Lanny you were like, I have to interview this person, like this is like a must?
Yeah, Lanny was obviously the one linchpin to the whole thing, but
Yeah.
in a weird, like kind of, I don't know, sad way, when he passed away in 2011, almost everyone who really knew him or wrestled with him or worked with him did their big podcast, radio interviews fresh, right? So they
Mm.
didn't have time to like really massage things. So, someone like Hogan or someone like that, I found over a dozen interviews with him talking about Macho, not only just in documentaries, but all these things on the record. So it's like, you'd think like you got to talk to Hogan. It's like after 7 interviews of him telling the same exact stories, he's not likely to give me something completely different that he gave the WWE or
Mm.
his own podcast or Joe Rogan or whatever he's talking to. So some of those guys, and originally I thought would be really important. Then I realized they've said everything they're probably going to say, at least in public, on these guys. So to me, the crucial people are the people around those big names. Like I had heard that him and Hacksaw Duggan were really good friends. And so, obviously a big star back in the day, but not on the Hogan level, of course. And so I wanted to make sure I talked to him, and I did. And some of these guys, when you talk to them, they mention a small thing. Macho is always good with kids. People always talked about that. I asked him about that. He's like, Mr. Wonderful's son was always around, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. And through Twitter, I was able to get in touch with Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff's son,
Mm.
who became one of my favorite interviews in the book. I mean, imagine we're that age. Imagine being, 8, 9 years old in the 1980s. Your father is Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, kissing his biceps, and you're finishing a show with your dad and going on a tour bus. And as you walk on this bus, there's Macho Man in the back and Junkyard Dog on the left and Andre the Giant over here and Hulk Hogan and Ted DiBiase over there. And that perspective was like perfect. Like you don't get that anywhere.
Yeah.
What is it like for a kid who's into wrestling, whose dad's a wrestler? What are these guys? They're gonna be who they really are more than anyone else right then. So those are the kind of interviews that I looked forward to and that I thought were the best.
That's amazing. And also what's so cool about it is because you were also you were that age when you were watching
Perfect.
Macho, I believe you said. So you can
Yep.
almost envision I
Oh
can
my God.
envision what I would have been like if I was in
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, exactly. And even there's some little things you learn, like picture, so you're 10 years old and you're a giant Macho Man fan and you love Hacksaw Jim Duggan. And then you find out, like, what do they do after matches? Like, well, I don't know what happens. And you find out that, like, Hacksaw and Macho, these two giant athletic dudes, they spend their time in a a long running game of chess. They play chess all the time. It's like, what? Like that's their thing. Like, and Hack's like, yeah, he was a really good chess player. I was good, but he was better. It's like, who would have ever thought that Macho Man is a chess guy? Like, he was a very cerebral guy. That kind of dovetailed with a lot of other things that I learned about Macho.
Mm.
He was well read. He was good at poker. He was good with money. He was good with really anything, any mental aspect of something. He was all over it. So I didn't know that stuff, and you don't until you talk to these guys.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And one of the things I'm always interested in when you do stuff like this, I interviewed the Angle director who Alex Perry who did the Cat Angle documentary from a few months back, and he talked about how it was how how difficult, how challenging it was to chronicle Kurt's story in this fixed amount of time, and it's even more so like rigid when you're doing a film.
Yeah.
Uh, what was it like in terms of the biography to like chronicle and actually like map out what you're going to talk about and how you're going to dissect this man's life? Because even Macho, in some
Yeah.
ways, has lived, 2, 3 different lives in this one lifespan.
Yeah, you have to. I trust my gut first, especially with someone like Macho. And I wouldn't write a book with someone who I wasn't familiar with, but I lived through this. I
Mm.
know the moments people want to hit. I know the stories that I find that are going to resonate. And I also know the stuff that, while maybe notable, is either not a fun story to tell or doesn't really need a dedicated amount of space to go through. So,
Mm.
yeah, for instance, when we finally, after all the pages and everything we get into, we know who he is, we know what he's accomplished, we know he reached WWF, we know he leaves, he transitions to the WCW. At this point, we're 250 something pages into a book about this guy. I really wanted to avoid 80 pages on the WCW, right? It just becomes, for most of the public consciousness, and I know the diehards will take some offense to this, but for most of the people who grew up in the 80s and early 90s watching this guy, once he left the WWF, he really kind of went off. He went off the national radar and went to that's when he did go. I know Nitro got huge and eventually the Die Hard, that was a big battle. But
Mm.
Macho himself, even with the NWO and even all that, was kind of never like the lead face that was Hogan and some of the other
No,
guys.
no, no.
And he never really, they went to the all black like all those guys did, but he was aging. He didn't age as well as Hogan because Hogan was still so big. Macho was not a big guy. He kind of got naturally smaller, as we all do when we hit our mid 40s and even that age. His knees were bad, his hips were bad. He wasn't doing all the athletic stuff that he could do. He still had a presence. So I had to make some decisions of like, I'm not going to spend after page 240 30 pages on the, the summer brawls and some of the things that he did then. And so I hit the highlights that I thought made sense and that really spoke to what that period of his time was like. But I wanted to get to who he became post WWF, post the highlights of the WCW, really into that Serenity period where he did. I mentioned obviously go into the rap album, which was a funny little dip in his world. I got talked to some extras on Spider-Man and people who are on set with Air, and then into like how his life kind of played out.
Yeah, no, I mean I doubt that actually makes a lot of sense because again, as a wrestling fan, I would have been like only this much on WCW, but you saying that makes perfect sense though.
And I get it. I haven't heard that. Maybe one person wrote me saying like, you left out, they listed a bunch of things that were all WCW. And I was
Mhm.
like, I appreciate that. I appreciate you saying it. I'm not, you make creative decisions that some people are
Mm.
going to agree with or not. I think for the 90% of Macho Man fans, this satisfies everything that you're going to want to know. And even if your only, issue is like, I didn't spend enough time on WCW, then that's fine. That means I did everything else right. I'm good with
Yeah,
that.
that's fair. No, to be fair, when you break it down as well, like his WCW career wasn't that
Right.
incredible in
Right.
fairness. Like there was
Right.
highlights, but there was not as much to talk about. So that's
Yeah.
fair. Um,
Exactly.
One of the you talked about some stories there, and especially with like Paul Orndorff's son, things of that nature, and obviously you've had countless stories, some true, some untrue. Was there anything that stood out, like any key takeaways when like stories that you heard that were like favorites of yours through the process of kind of like putting this book together,
Yeah,
without maybe spoiling anything if you don't
yeah,
want
yeah. No, one of
to?
the long running through lines of the book is his how good he was with kids. One of my favorite things that I uncovered, and I talked to the guy with the New York Yankees who set it up, was every year Macho Man read the night before Christmas to the Tampa Children's Hospital that was,
Hmm.
sponsored and founded by George Steinbrenner of the Yankees, and they had a team, their minor league team down in Tampa, and so he read it every year. He would go full macho gear, read night before Christmas, give a motivational, inspirational speech to all the kids. And the guy at the Yankees who I talked to was like, we used to ask other celebrities to do it, and they would do their speech and wave and head out. But the first year Macho did it, he did the speech and then stayed and met every single kid and shook their hand, gave them a little joke or a little line, their presents. They had a gift basket for all the kids. And when they asked some of the kids, the next year who they wanted to come back, they all, or who they would want in general, they all wanted Macho to come back. And then he did it for, I don't know, 12, 13 years, even as he was past wrestling, even after Spider-Man, when he started looking different with the white hair and all that,
Mhm.
he still did it and it was still relevant and he did it for the kids. And there's a bunch of different stories throughout the book that I weave in during the different time periods where pretty much no matter what was happening in his life, no matter what was going on, he always found time to make kids' days whenever he could.
That's a beautiful story, man.
It's great.
And
And you always want the subjects, I don't want to pick people, hopefully, who are, jerks, and he
mm,
certainly had his moments with his peers. But it's nice when you're doing a book and you uncover those kind of things that deep down, the things that matter. Maybe he was maybe he was difficult or to somebody in the locker room or one of the boys on the, whatever. But when you have a soft spot for kids, that's always awesome to learn.
yeah. And this, obviously, my podcast is titled the Wrestling and Film Podcast. I love the blend of wrestling and film. And obviously, with Machos, it's the iconic "Hey Freak Show" in
I got you for
Spider-Man.
3 minutes.
Yeah, in Spider-Man. I mean, I remember when I was very little and that came out and just being like, "Oh my God, like Macho Man and Spider-Man." It was the greatest thing for, 7-year-old kid to see.
Yeah.
Um, what was that like? As you said, there was you spoke to people in the extras and like chronicling that kind of because
Yeah.
it's really in the grand scheme of things, it's a very small scene, but it's it's a really fun scene. I think people who are non-wrestling fans also really enjoy it.
Yeah.
And again, it is basically Macho just being Macho
It
in
could have
Spider-Man.
been. I've seen there's a lot of when you do these books, you find these like rabbit holes and Reddit threads, and like there was a push for like a bone saw like comic and movie. Like, who is this guy? Like, where did he come from? Like, how is he? He's an underground wrestler in a cage who, like, he has bonettes. Like, this would be a fascinating story and a fascinating even comic of Bonesaw McGraw. Like, what a name too. And so yeah, I talked to some people on set, and they mentioned that like they were all like they grew up, they're in entertainment first, so they knew Macho Man, and Lanny told me he got the role 6 months out and had to really bulk up, and he looked like he was about to blow up. I mean,
Oh, so
who
he was
knows?
jacked, yeah.
I don't know what, he was almost 50. Like, who knows what concoction of things he was on to get there. I interviewed, Paul Roma, who was a wrestler for a long time in the WWE, who made a joke. He's like, man, I knew Randy and we worked out. I knew him for a long time. I took my kids to see that, and it wasn't until like a minute and a half into the scene that I was like, like, is that Randy? Like, he didn't even recognize, because he was like he said he was about to pop. Like, he looked like he was about to actually explode. Um, and so he took it. He was there for 3 days and did, three different days of shoots. It was overnight and things like that. He took it seriously. He taught a lot of even the stuntmen, like, here's how this role is going to go. Here's how this is going to work. Here's, work with Tobey Maguire and all these things. And it's actually one of the craziest scenes there. He actually really hurt his neck. If you watch the scene, the fight scene, he does an upside down like monkey roll off the ropes. And if you watch it,
Hmm.
he doesn't make the bounce onto his stomach. He lands on his neck, and he was out. Like, he was out on set for like 12 minutes. They were terrified. They thought he was paralyzed. They thought he's like 47 or whatever he was at the
Hmm.
time. They thought he broke his neck, and he managed to get up, took a bunch more takes, and then didn't get out of bed for like 3 days when it was over. And
Wow.
even Lanny said that like for the rest of his life, I think he was turning left, he like turned his whole body left. He couldn't really move his neck. But he was all in on that, like he was with everything else. And you're right. It's three, I got you for 3 minutes. So the scene's maybe 5 minutes, but it's iconic. Like you can't tell. People bring up Spider-Man, and maybe one of the only things you remember, especially about that first one, as big as that movie was that Macho was in it.
Yeah, and certainly for me, and so I'm sure for you as well. Do you
Yeah.
remember your reaction when you watched that?
Same as yours. Like I went to see the movie, and then you're like, huh, oh my God, like, is that Randy Savage? And then it's like, I remember leaving and I was like, I just want to see that scene again. And then back then we were early internet-ish. Like you couldn't just go on and the next day there'd be the 3-minute clip of Randy Savage that
Yeah,
someone bootlegged. You had to wait till either I didn't go see it in the theater again just for that, but you had to wait till I don't know, HBO or the DVD or whatever to enjoy that scene again.
yeah, and one of that is also that has resulted in, I think, one of the best wrestling memes, where it's like
Yeah.
Randy Savage wrestled for 30 years to prepare for the
Yeah,
role
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
Enzo.
Now the 3 minutes is great. That whole
Yeah,
line is just, especially when you're wrestling with your kids or like, you can anybody, someone has you have a second, and then I got you for 3 minutes as a meme. It's great.
yeah. And you mentioned you literally took the words out of my mouth there. You said he was all in, and that's what he was like all the time, like throughout his life, all
Yeah.
in, like, and like to an obsessive and like almost to for some people like they can't fathom how dialed in he was to like baseball and then wrestling and then even this just one 3 5 minute scene for
Yeah.
Spider-Man. Do you think that's also a thing that's almost like not lost on people, but it's something that's especially maybe in today's day and age where it's a shock to certain people to see how dialed in someone is like it's someone like Macho.
Yeah, I think you're seeing everybody, we all got to see the end result, right? Like he was that driven as a kid. I mean, the reason that I spent so much time on his baseball career is because it's compelling and it's exciting, and he was good and he had some great stories. But this is a kid who walked around his grade school and middle school with his backpack and his bat bag. He didn't like he sat in the back of class not to like goof off, but he brought a weighted baseball. He would do tricep kickbacks to work on his forearms and to work on his triceps. And his dad and other dads in the neighborhood built they built a batting cage on the side of his house in Chicago so he could practice all year round. He was obsessed. Whatever he was into, he was obsessed. And yeah, as a society, sure, I think we could use more people who become obsessed with their craft and focus on excellence, and whether it was trying to make the major leagues or drawing heat in a wrestling match or being on Spider-Man or even his rap album. He put everything into it. I mean, he was kind of a renaissance man in that way. Like there's not many people that play minor league baseball, have a national commercial that goes mainstream, have a wrestling title, icon, a Hall of Famer in a sport, and then a rap album,
Yeah.
and appear in a superhero movie.
Yeah, he crossed a lot of boxes.
Yeah.
Um, and also one of the things that was really touching when I saw on your Instagram, I think, or your Twitter as well, is the story about you taking your daughter to the tree that where Macho unfortunately passed.
Yeah.
What I don't know, Maggie, I don't know how much you want to share about that, in terms of it crossing over the book and stuff, but like, what was that like for you personally as well as professionally?
Yeah, no, my favorite part of writing this book, any dad will tell you, is when the kids get old enough to kind of understand what you do and you can kind of share with them what you're working on and what you're passionate about. It doesn't, whatever you're into, it doesn't have to be even work. If you're passionate about building airplanes or whatever it is, like when they start to kind of get what you're into and you can share it with them, it's great. My son is heavily into macho, I mean, heavily into wrestling. He watched all the old WrestleManias with me. He watched all the Piper's Pits and all the YouTube stuff, and he filmed me making all my goofy promos promoting the book, and it's great. And then, in addition to that, when I had to do research trips for the book, we live in South Florida, but Macho was in Tampa, about 4 hours north. And so, my daughter, I love hanging out with her. I invited her on the road trip with me to go up there, and we went to go see the tree. I mean, amongst other things, I wanted to see his house and his condo and his gym and all these other things. But one of the cornerstones was to see the tree where, for those listening who don't know, Macho passed away, and he had a heart attack while driving a car. His wife at the time really saved a lot of lives. He was heavy. He slumped over with his foot on the accelerator. She pulled his foot off, steered the wheel like out of traffic, and they ran into this tree.
Hmm.
This tree's become like a de facto memorial for him, and it's not marked. There's no signage. There's no way to really see it. I found it by looking at like local papers and police reports, and kind of triangulating, like there's a church here and there's a pharmacy over here, and this tree, there's a boat over here in the background, and we found it. And it was like a little detective, scavenger hunt for the two of us driving up there. She had all the pictures in the passenger seat. She was very skeptical. She didn't, she doesn't really watch wrestling that much, and was like, why would it's a tree? Like the whole time, like anyone who has like a 12-year-old daughter, it's like, tree, we're driving to it. We stopped and had good times. And I let her listen to Taylor Swift, whatever she wanted. But at the end of the day, I got a lot of just like, it's just a tree comments. But then when we got there and she saw the purple tassels and the macho glasses and the thumbtack Slim Jim stuff all around it, like it connected with her, it landed with her, how magnificent this stuff was, and how he still mattered 11, 12 years later. And it was just a wonderful moment for us.
That's really nice, man. And if I guess that if nothing else, like you always have that memory as well with this book.
Oh, the book, yeah, the book, all the things that are career wise with Macho, with the storytelling, people reading it, are all immensely gratifying. And then when you're a dad, you take those moments in as well. And so I'll always remember the Macho Man book for my son researching with me, and then my daughter coming on the big 3 or 4 day road trip to do things with him. And we had a blast. Other than that, I built in some obviously other fun things. We went to Hogan's gift shop and we went to the beach. We did a lot of other fun stuff. But she was my co-pilot. We found his house. We found, the house, his condo, his house that he moved into to get away from everybody. It was really fun.
And the tree, I mean, I don't know if anyone else or I'm overthinking this, but in one of the documentaries, they talk about when Macho finished baseball, he broke all his bats, like
Oh, yeah.
but he broke it against a tree. He broke all
Yeah.
the baseball bats against a tree.
Yeah.
And then all these years later, when he
Yeah.
passes,
Very
I was like,
poetic.
yeah, the symbolism there. I don't know if that's ever
Yeah,
crossed
no,
your mind or ever.
when he finished baseball, I found he had a bunch. Amazingly, his high school team actually had a bunch of talent. 2 or 3 guys made the majors, not him, in fact.
Hmm.
And one of his friends he went to, after he got cut for the final time, he went to his house and was, two dudes in their 20s. His dream was over, just sleeping on his couch, didn't know where to go, what to do, woke up and drove all the way from Sarasota home to Chicago. And he got there at night, and he had his bat bag, and they were done with him, and he was done with baseball for good. And he went and shattered all the bats against this tree under the moonlight. And it was this moment. And so, yeah, to circle back later that his life ends like that, it's certainly, I mean, I wish he was still around. I'd rather have that, but
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
is like a sort of like a common theme there.
Yeah, no, it was just something that struck me, and I was just like, oh wow, yeah, I don't know what you want to call it, but yes, a symbolism, I'm not sure, but yeah,
Yeah,
it was interesting to say the least.
for sure.
And just my final question, because we're filming this a day before WrestleMania weekend,
Yes.
um, what's your favorite Macho Man WrestleMania moment, John? I mean, you could give me even two answers when you were a kid, and then maybe as an adult, if
They're the
it
same,
changed.
actually. They're the same.
Okay.
They're the same. Macho Man versus Ultimate Warrior is still my two favorites were Macho, and then when Warrior came on, I think he kind of became every kid's sort of second favorite guy. He
Yeah.
was just so magnetic and incredible and energetic. And when I was a kid, I liked it because it was just my two favorite guys, and they were running around, and that was actually one of the times a Warrior walked to the ring instead of running to the ring, and everything was kind of just the height. And they remember it was a retirement match, so like I remember being at lunch talking to my friends, like, so one of these guys is never going to wrestle again. Like I believed that. And so that was the stakes to it. And then the match itself was awesome. And I mean, Warriors trying to put him down, and these gods are betraying him, and he's looking up at the sky, and Macho's hitting him with the elbow. It's just perfect. And then as an adult watching it, you just realize realistically, like the size gap that Macho's giving up. He was always trying to make up for the fact that he wasn't Hulk and he wasn't Andre and he wasn't 6'4", 250 naturally. And when they fight, looking at it as a grown man and watching it, I'm 200 pounds and I think I'm in pretty good shape. That he's 230, and how big Warrior was and how Warrior ragdolled him. I mean, the gorilla presses, he picked him up like his little brother. And so it's a real dichotomy of age and size and athleticism, and storyline. Of course, he loses, and Sherry, and then mine Elizabeth comes out, and he
Yeah.
loves him. He's always loved it. All that stuff is the pageantry of it all. It's like perfect wrestling.
It's funny you say that because this figure I got here is the
I
WrestleMania
love it.
7 Macho
Yeah,
Man,
yeah,
which is my favorite costume for sure, Macho.
yeah.
Uh, I mean, I think that's a wonderful way to end it, John. And can I just say thank you so much for your time? I really appreciate just the time you've given me and just diving and hearing all these stories. And it just makes me more excited to get my hands on the book. And when I read it, I will definitely get back to you and be like,
Yeah,
keep
reach
my
out.
other.
Hopefully everybody gets it. We've had a fun run so far. You got Becky Lynch at the top with her biography and her
Yeah.
autobiography. So it's the man versus the Macho Man, and Brad's book's doing well. All of us, me and Brad, are trying to take her on, maybe. So yeah, make sure you get the book, and if you do, let me know. I'm on Twitter. I'm on everywhere. Tag me when this comes out, and tag me a screenshot.
Absolutely.
Cool hologram stickers of the cover I can give away. But yeah, I just look forward to everybody reading it and coming along this Macho Madness ride with us.
Yeah, no, I think you're doing a wonderful job as well, just selling to everyone as well, because it's just so exciting to hear and also to see that it's not just one of those biographies where it's just people just skim over things
Yeah.
and just like you've really dug deep and
Meticulous, yeah. It's
yes,
all on like the way Macho Man planned WrestleMania 3. That's how I
yeah,
planned his biography.
step by step by step.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you, John. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you, and enjoy WrestleMania weekend and Philly.
Yes, we're flying out 5 o'clock in the morning tomorrow. Can't wait.
Great, and I look forward to I'm sure seeing posts about that as well.
Oh, for sure.
Thanks, John.
You got it.
Thank you, man.